We're all familiar with the T-34 and Sherman tanks that dominate the battlefields of World War II. But what about the rarest tanks to see combat? Here's a look at some of the rarest tanks that saw combat during the war, plus a special bonus tank at the end which stands out as one of the most unique and fascinating of them all. The Neubaufahrzeug was an ambitious yet ultimately impractical attempt by Germany to develop a multi-turreted heavy tank in the 1930s. Designed as an experimental vehicle, it was meant to explore the potential of large, heavily armed tanks before Germany settled on more practical designs like the Panzer IV. The project originated as part of the Reichswehr's secret rearmament efforts, influenced by contemporary multi-turreted tanks such as the British Vickers Independent and the Soviet T-35. The Neubaufahrzeug was an imposing machine, weighing between 23 and 25 tons and measuring approximately 6.7 meters in length. It stood 2.9 meters tall. With a top speed of 25 kilometers, it was sluggish even by the standards of the era. Its main turret housed both a short-barreled 75mm cannon and a 37mm cannon. The vehicle also featured two M34 machine guns mounted in smaller turrets at the front and the rear. Manning such a complex vehicle required a 6-man crew. The layout, while intimidating, proved to be more of a hindrance than an advantage. The need to coordinate multiple weapon systems made the tank inefficient in combat, and its sheer size and slow speed made it vulnerable to enemy attacks. Despite these drawbacks, 5 prototypes were built, 2 made of mild steel for testing, and 3 combat-ready models. Although it was never intended for mass production, it was used for propaganda purposes and did see limited action during the German invasion of Norway in 1940. The 3 combat-ready prototypes were deployed around Oslo, where they were primarily used to impress both German troops and foreign observers. However, their performance was underwhelming, plagued by mechanical failures and poor maneuverability. Only one of the tanks actually made it to the front lines, as 2 were disabled due to mechanical problems. The sole Neubaufahrzeug engaged British and Norwegian forces near Baalberg. The British, armed with .55-inch boys, anti-tank rifles, quickly exposed the tank's vulnerability. The rifles proved more than capable of penetrating its armour, with multiple rounds striking the vehicle. After sustaining dozens of hits and losing a crew member, the tank was forced to withdraw. Despite its shortcomings, the Neubaufahrzeug played a small role in the evolution of German armoured warfare. Lessons learned from its development influenced later tank designs, particularly the Panzer IV and the Tiger series. Germany wasn't alone in experimenting with multi-turreted tanks. The T-35 was one of the most imposing and ambitious tanks of the interwar period, a massive multi-turreted land battleship designed to embody Soviet military might. Developed in the early 1930s, it was inspired by Western experiments with multi-turreted tanks, particularly the British Vickers Independent. The Soviet Union took the concept further, creating a true behemoth that would become the only multi-turreted tank to ever see limited production. However, despite its intimidating presence, the T-35 ultimately proved to be more of a showpiece than an effective battlefield weapon. Weighing around 50 tons, the T-35 was over 9.7 meters long and required a crew of up to 11 men to operate, far more than most tanks of the era. Its firepower was extensive, featuring a 76.2mm main gun in the central turret, complemented by 2 45mm 20K cannons in the smaller turrets at the front. Additionally, it had between 5 and 7 D-29 machine guns, positioned in various locations to provide all-round defense. This arrangement allowed it to engage multiple targets at once, at least in theory. In reality, coordinating all these weapons was a logistical nightmare, and the tank's sheer size made communication and maneuvering incredibly difficult. Despite its firepower, the T-35 suffered from several critical flaws. Its armour, ranging from 11 to 30mm thick, was inadequate by the time World War II began, offering little protection against contemporary anti-tank weapons. Its 500 horsepower M17 engine was underpowered for such a massive vehicle, resulting in poor maneuverability and frequent mechanical failures. With a top speed of only 30 km an hour on roads and much less off-road, it struggled to keep up with modern mechanized warfare, making it vulnerable to more agile enemies. Only 60 were ever produced, and their most notable role was during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. However, its battlefield performance was dismal. Most T-35s never made it into direct combat, breaking down due to mechanical issues long before reaching the front lines. Those that did engage the enemy were quickly outmatched, as their large profile and weak armour made them easy targets. Many were simply abandoned by their crews or destroyed by their own forces to prevent capture. The T-35 was recognised as obsolete prior to World War II, and efforts were made to develop a modern heavy tank. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union developed the T-100 and the SMK, experimental heavy tanks, continuing the Red Army's fascination with the concept of a multi-turreted tank. Designed to replace the T-35, these massive machines featured enhanced armour and firepower while maintaining the capability to engage multiple targets simultaneously. However, they arrived at a time when tank warfare was rapidly evolving, and an outdated design philosophy sealed their fate before they could ever see mass production. Both tanks were designed in response to a Soviet request for a new breakthrough tank capable of withstanding enemy fire and supporting infantry and assaults. The T-100 and SMK were remarkably similar and shared many characteristics. Each weighed over 55 tons and featured two turrets, one housing a 76.2mm gun and the other a smaller 75mm cannon. The idea was to provide layered firepower, allowing the tank to handle various threats simultaneously. Additional D-29 machine guns were mounted in multiple positions to offer extra defense against infantry. A crew of up to 7 men was needed to operate these giants. The tanks were powered by GAM-34 engines, giving them a top speed of around 35 km an hour on roads, but significantly less off-road. Their armour was formidable for the time, with frontal plates up to 60mm thick, offering decent protection against many contemporary anti-tank weapons. The only real combat experience for these experimental tanks came during the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940, during the Battle of Suma. The SMK and T-100 were deployed alongside the newer KV-1 for trials against Finnish defences. However, the battle quickly exposed the weaknesses of the multi-turreted designs. Their large size made them easy targets, and their weight made them difficult to maneuver in Finland's harsh terrain. Their armour protection did withstand numerous hits, but eventually the SMK was knocked out by a mine and was abandoned on the battlefield. Soviet engineers, observing the engagement, realised the single-turreted KV-1 performed better in almost every aspect, leading to its selection for mass production. Ultimately, the T-100 and SMK were abandoned as impractical relics of an outdated doctrine. They were too cumbersome, too complex, and too vulnerable in the fast-paced warfare that was beginning to define the era. While they never saw widespread use, they played a crucial role in proving that multi-turreted tanks were a dead end, paving the way for the development of more practical Soviet heavy tanks like the KV-1. Only one SMK was made and it was scrapped after it was recovered from the battlefield. Two T-100s were developed, with one being modified into the Su-100Y, a self-propelled gun which took part in the defense of Moscow. This tank can be seen in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Moscow. The single-turreted KV-1 eventually went into mass production, with over 5,000 being built. The P-26-40 was Italy's long overdue attempt to field a true heavy tank during World War II, a machine that on paper could have rivaled contemporary Allied armour. However, like many Italian military projects of the era, it suffered from delays, logistical challenges, and a shifting battlefield that rendered it obsolete before it could make a real impact. Despite this, it remains an intriguing example of Italian armour development and the challenges the country faced in modernising its military. Designed in the early 1940s, the P-26-40 was intended to counter increasingly powerful Allied tanks, particularly the Soviet T-34 and American M4 Shermans. Italian tank doctrine had long focused on lighter, more mobile vehicles, but battlefield experiences in North Africa and the Eastern Front highlighted a desperate need for something with better armour and firepower. The result was a 26-ton tank, hence P-26 designation, equipped with a 75mm cannon, capable of engaging enemy armour with reasonable effectiveness. Secondary armament consists of two 8mm Breda machine guns, one coaxial and another mounted in the hull for anti-infantry defence. The tank's armour was a significant step up from previous Italian designs, featuring up to 50mm of frontal protection, though it remained vulnerable to more powerful anti-tank weapons at the time. Powering the vehicle was a V12 diesel engine producing 330 horsepower, which provided a top speed of around 40 km an hour, reasonable for a tank of its class. However, Italy's industrial capacity struggled to mass produce the engine, leading to some models being fitted with less reliable gasoline alternatives. While the layout was functional, Italian tanks' ergonomics were often cramped and uncomfortable, reducing overall efficiency in prolonged engagements. Despite these drawbacks, the P-26 was, at least on paper, Italy's best armoured fighting vehicle of the war. But by the time Italy had signed the armistice with the Allies, only 21 units were complete. Germany ordered that production to continue, and the tanks that did roll off the production line were repurposed as the Panzerkampfwagen P-40 737 and used them for defence operations in northern Italy. In the end, over 100 were produced, with only a small handful seeing limited action, with their impact being marginal at best. Ultimately, the P-26-40 was another example of Italy's war industry being outpaced by the demands of modern mechanised warfare. The 43M Turan III was Hungary's last attempt at fielding a competitive medium tank during World War II, a testament to the country's determination to modernise its armed forces in the face of overwhelming Soviet advances. Based on earlier Turan models, the Turan III sought to address the growing obsolescence of Hungarian armour by incorporating improved firepower and protection. However, despite its potential, it remained a rare sight in the battlefield, produced in extremely limited numbers as Hungary struggled to keep pace with the war's escalating demands. Designed as an evolution of Turan II, the Turan III was fitted with a 75mm gun, a significant upgrade over its predecessor's weaker armaments. The new weapon gave it the ability to engage Soviet T-34s on more equal terms, though it still faced considerable challenges against newer enemy designs. The tank's armour was also reinforced, reaching up to 75mm on the frontal plates, offering improved resistance against the enemy fire. A notable feature was the addition of German-style side skirts, which provided extra protection against Soviet anti-tank rifles. Despite these improvements, the Turan III was still hampered by its origins. The chassis, derived from the older Czechoslovakian Skoda T21 design, was not originally intended to support such heavy armour and a high-velocity gun. Weighing around 38 tons, the tank retained a respectable top speed of 40 km/h, which was on par with many contemporary medium tanks. However, its 260 horsepower engine struggled under the added weight, likely affecting acceleration and overall manoeuvrability, particularly on rough terrain. The 5-man crew had to contend with cramped and inefficient layout, a common issue in Hungarian armoured vehicles. By the time the Turan III was ready for production in 1944, Hungary was already in a dire position. Facing relentless Soviet offences, only a handful, possibly just 2 to 5 prototypes were ever completed, and they saw little combat before the country was overrun. When making this list, I strayed away from modifications or variations as they are endless, and I won't consider them true rare tanks as there are other versions of them out there. But I am making an exception for the next tank as I just love the uniqueness of it. During World War II, the German army captured hundreds of tanks and armoured vehicles from the nations it invaded, including the Soviet Union. Many of these captured machines were upgraded and modified to suit German needs, leading to some of the most intriguing armoured vehicle adaptations of the war. Germany called these tanks Butterpanzer. The Panzerkampfwagen KV-1B 756 was a rare and intriguing example of a Butterpanzer. This particular vehicle began its life as a Soviet KV-1 heavy tank, a formidable machine known for its thick armour and powerful gun. However, after falling into German hands, it underwent extensive modifications to better suit the needs of its operators. The KV-1 was the Soviet Union's most feared early war tanks, boasting armour that was nearly impervious to most German anti-tank weapons in 1941. With its 76.2mm cannon, heavy protection and robust design, it proved to be a nightmare for the invading Wehrmacht. But as the war progressed, the Soviets improved their armour and weaponry, leading the Germans to re-evaluate their use of captured KV-1s. Instead of merely repainting and redeploying them, German engineers decided to modify some of their tanks to better align with their own doctrines and logistical needs. One such upgrade resulted in the Panzerkampfwagen KV-1 756, where the Soviets' original turret and gun were replaced with a German 75mm cannon, the same weapon used on later models of the Panzer IV. This significantly enhanced the tank's firepower, allowing it to engage enemy armour more effectively. Additional modifications included German commander's copula, improved optics, and adjustments to internal systems to accommodate Wehrmacht tank crews. Despite these improvements, the tank retained much of its Soviet engineering. While it retained the KV-1's thick armour, the added German components helped improve visibility and targeting, giving it a slight edge in battlefield awareness. However, due to its mixed heritage, spare parts were difficult to procure, making long-term maintenance a challenge. The Panzerkampfwagen KV-1 saw limited use on the Eastern Front, where Germany employed captured tanks to supplement its armoured forces, and only one photo of the tank exists today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Odd Historian. Check out this video about how a Russian cook took out a tank with his axe. And check out my Patreon for exclusive content and if you would like to support this channel. See you next time.